I had always fantasized about escaping the chaos of city life for a weekend in a remote cabin. The idea of disconnecting from the digital world, breathing in the fresh mountain air, and spending my days in utter peace sounded like a dream. So when I found a listing for a cabin that promised isolation, no cell service, and complete seclusion deep in the wilderness, I didn't hesitate to book it. I didn't even tell my friends. I just wanted time to myself. The drive took nearly 5 hours, the last stretch a winding dirt road that seemed to narrow with every mile. I didn't see a single car after I passed through the last tiny town, and I felt a sense of excitement grow as the wilderness thickened around me. By the time I reached the cabin, dusk was starting to settle over the mountains, casting long shadows through the dense trees. It was perfect. The little wooden cabin stood alone on a small clearing, with a view of the forest stretching endlessly behind it. I parked my car and stepped out, feeling the crisp evening air fill my lungs. The silence was almost surreal. No hum of traffic, no chatter of people, just the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I grabbed my bags from the trunk and made my way to the front door. The key was under a loose rock by the steps, just as the owner had said. It was a simple one-room cabin with a tiny kitchen, a fireplace, and a small loft for sleeping, quaint, cozy, and completely isolated. I unpacked quickly, eager to settle in for the night. There was no Wi-Fi, no TV, nothing but a stack of books and the soft crackle of the fireplace for entertainment. I ate a simple dinner, made a cup of tea, and sat by the fire, enjoying the warmth as the night deepened around me. The window in front of me showed nothing but darkness, with the faint outline of trees just visible in the firelight. As the night grew colder, I climbed up to the loft, feeling the exhaustion of the long drive settle into my bones. The bed was comfortable, and the blankets were thick and warm. I drifted off almost instantly. Sometime during the night, I woke up suddenly, my heart pounding in my chest. At first, I thought it was the remnants of a dream, but then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, crunching through the leaves just outside the cabin. I froze, listening, my ears straining against the silence. The sound grew louder, closer, and I felt a cold dread wash over me. There was no one else out here, no one for miles. I waited, holding my breath, hoping the sound would stop, but it didn't. The footsteps circled the cabin, heavy and purposeful, as though someone was walking in slow circles around the building. I crept out of bed and made my way to the window, careful not to make a sound. I pressed my face to the glass, but there was nothing to see, just darkness. The footsteps stopped. For a moment I stood there, my heart still racing. Maybe it was an animal, I thought, a deer or something, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. The footsteps had been too measured, too human. I returned to bed, my ears still on high alert. Minutes passed, and just as I was about to convince myself I had imagined the whole thing, a soft knock echoed through the cabin. I shot upright, my breath catching in my throat. The knock came again, this time a little louder, more insistent. It was coming from the front door. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and made my way downstairs, my heart hammering in my chest. The knock came again, and I paused at the bottom of the stairs, staring at the door. I didn't want to open it, but what choice did I have? I took a deep breath, reached for the doorknob, and slowly pulled it open. There was no one there. I stepped out onto the porch, shining the flashlight into the darkness. The beam cut through the trees, illuminating the dense forest beyond. But there was no movement, no sign of anyone or anything nearby. The air was still and cold, and the only sound was the soft rustling of the wind in the leaves. I retreated back inside, locking the door behind me. I didn't know what to think. Was someone messing with me? Had someone followed me out here? I had been so sure that no one knew where I was. I hadn't even told my friends the exact location. I returned to bed, my mind racing, but sleep didn't come easily. I lay there for hours, listening to the silence, half expecting the footsteps to return. But the night passed without any more disturbances. The next morning, I awoke to the sunlight streaming through the window. The events of the night before seemed distant, like a bad dream. Maybe I had imagined it all, I thought. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me in the isolation. I spent the day exploring the area around the cabin, hiking through the woods and soaking in the peacefulness of the mountains. It was exactly what I had wanted, a break from the hectic, noisy world. But as the sun began to set again, a sense of unease crept back into my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, I built a larger fire, hoping the warmth and light would keep the creeping dread at bay. But as soon as I climbed back into bed, the footsteps returned. This time they were louder, more deliberate. They circled the cabin again, slow and methodical, as if someone was pacing just beyond the reach of the light. I jumped out of bed and grabbed the flashlight, my hands trembling. I didn't care anymore. I had to see what was out there. I ran to the window and shone the light into the darkness. At first I saw nothing, just trees and shadows. But then, just at the edge of the clearing, I saw movement. A figure. It was tall, too tall to be a normal person, and its limbs were long and spindly. It stood there, motionless, staring back at me. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its gaze. I stumbled back from the window, my heart racing. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. I grabbed my phone, but of course there was no service. I was completely cut off from the world, trapped in this isolated cabin with whatever that thing was. The footsteps started again, this time right outside the door. I heard a scraping sound, like nails dragging across the wood. Then the knocking returned, harder, more insistent. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. I had no idea what to do. If I stayed, whatever it was might break in. But if I left, I'd be wandering through the dark, dense forest with no idea where I was going. The knocking grew louder, more frantic. I had to make a decision. With shaking hands, I grabbed my car keys and made a dash for the back door. I burst out into the cold night, sprinting towards the car. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if it was following me. I reached the car, fumbled with the keys, and finally managed to get the door open. I jumped inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. I sped down the dirt road, my heart pounding in my chest, the cabin quickly disappearing into the distance. It wasn't until I reached the main road that I finally stopped to catch my breath. My hands were still shaking, and my mind was reeling. Whatever had been at that cabin, it wasn't human. I don't know what it was, and I don't want to know. All I know is that I'll never return to those mountains again.
It was a last-minute decision to stop for the night. The drive along the coast had taken longer than expected, and I was too tired to continue. I'd been on a road trip, driving from one beach town to the next, hoping to find some kind of peace after the stress of work and city life had started wearing me down. So, when I spotted the sign for a small seaside inn just off the highway, I pulled over without a second thought. The inn was modest, a little weather-beaten but charming in its way. The receptionist, an elderly woman with a kind smile, handed me the key and told me I'd be in room 212. "You're lucky," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "Not many guests this time of year." I didn't think much of it at the time. The place was quiet, and after driving for hours, I was grateful for that. I thanked her and made my way up the narrow staircase, the wood creaking beneath my feet as I walked. The hallway was dimly lit, the wallpaper peeling in spots, but it had a certain quaint charm. Room 212 was at the very end of the hall. As soon as I opened the door, I felt a strange heaviness in the air. The room itself seemed ordinary enough, clean, with a simple bed, a small dresser, and an old-fashioned TV. But something was off. The air felt thick, almost oppressive. A cold draft seemed to seep through the window even though it was tightly shut. I dropped my bag on the bed and went to the window, looking out at the ocean below. The waves crashed against the shore, the sky darkening as the sun set over the water. The view was beautiful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Shaking it off, I closed the curtains and turned on the TV. Static greeted me. I flipped through the channels, but no matter how many times I tried, I couldn't find a single station. Frustrated, I turned it off and decided to take a quick shower. The bathroom was small, with a single light bulb flickering overhead. The mirror was foggy, and the shower head dripped steadily, the sound echoing in the cramped space. I undressed and stepped into the shower, letting the hot water relax my muscles. For a moment, I felt the tension start to ease. That's when I heard it, a whisper, faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere outside the bathroom. I turned off the water, straining to listen. The sound had stopped. I wrapped a towel around myself and stepped out into the room, my heart pounding. The room was exactly as I'd left it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I checked the door. It was still locked. The window hadn't moved. But that whisper, it had been so clear. I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe I was just tired, my mind playing tricks on me after hours on the road. But as the night wore on, the feeling of unease only grew stronger. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt as though I wasn't alone. I tossed and turned for what felt like hours, until finally, sometime after midnight, I dozed off. I woke suddenly, my heart racing, to the sound of the door creaking open. I sat up, staring at the door. It was still shut, the deadbolt in place. But I had heard it, hadn't I? A slow, deliberate creak, like someone was pushing it open. I got out of bed and checked the door again, feeling the cold metal of the bolt. It hadn't moved. As I turned to go back to bed, something caught my eye, a shadow, flickering just at the edge of my vision. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat, but the room was empty. I grabbed my phone, wanting to call someone, anyone, but there was no signal. Of course. The one time I needed my phone to work, it was useless. I sat there, feeling utterly alone, the weight of the room pressing in on me. And then, I heard the whisper again. This time, it was louder, clearer. A voice, low and rasping, coming from the corner of the room. I froze, my skin prickling with fear. It wasn't my imagination. Someone was there. I slowly turned my head toward the corner, my eyes wide, expecting to see something. But there was nothing there. Just the same empty room. I stood, my legs shaking, and backed toward the door, not daring to take my eyes off that corner. The whispering continued, growing louder, more insistent, like a conversation just out of earshot. My hand fumbled for the doorknob, desperate to get out. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped. The silence was deafening. I opened the door and bolted down the hallway, my footsteps echoing off the walls. When I reached the front desk, the receptionist was gone. The lobby was empty, eerily quiet in the dead of night. I pounded on the desk, calling out for help, but no one answered. Panicking, I ran back to my room, grabbed my bag, and left. I didn't care about the time, or the fact that I had nowhere else to go. I just needed to get out of that place. As I drove away, the headlights of my car illuminating the dark, winding road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For just a second, I thought I saw something. A figure standing in the middle of the road, watching me drive away. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. The next morning, I called the inn to explain why I had left without checking out. The woman who answered sounded confused. "We haven't had guests in weeks," she said. "We're closed for the season." I hung up, my hands trembling. To this day, I don't know what I experienced in that room, but I'll never forget the whispering.
We had rented a beach house for the summer. It was the perfect spot, right on the water, with a view of the ocean that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. My friends and I had been planning this trip for months, meticulously choosing the most picturesque location for what we thought would be a dream vacation. We imagined lazy days surfing and sunbathing, bonfires on the sand, and nights filled with laughter. It was supposed to be the best time of our lives. But from the moment we arrived, something felt off. The house itself was beautiful, sleek and modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows that allowed the sunlight to pour in, and a massive deck that extended toward the sea like a pathway to serenity. Yet, as breathtaking as the setting was, there was something about the air inside the house. It felt thick, heavy, almost suffocating, like the house was holding on to something unseen, something it didn't want to let go. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just my nerves after the long drive. But no matter how much I reasoned with myself, the unease clung to me like a shadow. The first few days passed without incident, but there was an underlying tension in the air. Little things, small, unexplainable events, began to pile up. At first, it was easy to laugh them off. A door that was open one moment and inexplicably closed the next. The faint sound of footsteps on the floor above when we were all downstairs. We blamed it on the wind or the house settling, making nervous jokes to mask our growing discomfort. But deep down, we were all starting to feel it, the creeping sense that we weren't alone. The strangeness escalated slowly until the little things no longer felt like quirks of an old house. One night, we were sitting on the deck, watching the sun melt into the horizon in a blaze of fiery orange, the rhythmic sound of the waves providing a peaceful soundtrack to the evening. We were finally relaxing, letting the day's warmth sink into our bones when the peace shattered. The scream. It ripped through the air like a knife, a shrill, blood-curdling sound that echoed through the walls of the house. We all froze. It was the kind of scream that turned your blood cold, the kind you couldn't mistake for anything else. And yet, there was no one else in the house. There shouldn't have been anyone else. For a moment, none of us moved. It was as if we were collectively holding our breath, waiting for something, anything, to explain away the sound. But nothing came. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing in on us from all sides. My heart was racing, my skin cold despite the warm evening air. Without thinking, I jumped up and ran inside, my feet moving before my brain could fully comprehend the fear that had taken hold of me. The others followed, each of us frantic, searching room after room for the source of the scream. But there was no one. Nothing. The house was empty, just as it had been when we first arrived. We tried to laugh it off, but it was forced, brittle, like glass about to shatter. Maybe it was the wind, we told ourselves. Maybe some strange acoustics with the ocean. But we knew, deep down, that wasn't the answer. Something was wrong with this house. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as the sound of the waves grew more distant, more muted. The darkness felt thicker than usual, like it was pressing in around me, suffocating me. I don't know how long I lay there, half awake, half dreaming, when I heard it again. The scream, this time, it was closer, more desperate. It sounded like someone was being torn apart, their agony reverberating through the walls. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The others had heard it too. They were already in the hallway, their faces pale and wide-eyed, the terror written plainly across their features. We stood there, listening, the scream echoing through the house, growing louder, more frantic, as though it was coming from somewhere deep beneath the floorboards. There was something malevolent in that sound, something that made my stomach turn with dread. We searched again, desperately this time, turning over furniture, checking closets, running from room to room like terrified children. But there was still no one there, no explanation, just the deafening silence that followed the scream, as if the house itself was mocking us. That night felt like it would never end. Every creak, every gust of wind felt like a threat. I kept expecting to see something lurking in the shadows, something watching us, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The air was thick with dread, and I could barely breathe. By morning, we were all exhausted, too shaken to stay another night. We packed our bags in silence, the weight of what we had experienced pressing down on us like a vice. As we drove away, I glanced back at the house, half expecting to see something in one of the windows, a face, a figure, anything that could explain the terror that had gripped us. But there was nothing, just the empty windows staring blankly out at the sea. To this day, I don't know what was in that house or why it screamed, but I know one thing for certain. I'll never set foot in that place again.
It was supposed to be a fun day of sightseeing. I had been backpacking through Europe solo for weeks, chasing adventure, and when I heard about a guided tour of an ancient castle on the outskirts of town, it seemed like the perfect opportunity. The castle was notorious, not just for its history, but for its dark legends, rumors of hauntings that stretched back centuries. It sounded like a cool, spine-chilling experience, the kind of story I could tell my friends back home. The tour group was small, just me and 5 other travelers. Our guide was an older man, his skin weathered from years under the sun, his accent thick and unfamiliar, but his tone had a gravitas that demanded attention. His demeanor was gruff, his eyes cold, yet there was something oddly magnetic about him. He seemed to know the castle like the back of his hand, rattling off facts and chilling stories as we ventured through the towering gates and into the echoing halls. At first, everything seemed normal, charming even. The castle was breathtaking, with its high, arching stone walls, narrow, winding staircases, and long, weathered tapestries that seemed frozen in time. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on the floor. But the deeper we ventured into the castle, the more the atmosphere seemed to change, as if the very air around us thickened, becoming heavier and colder. The light that once filtered in through the windows now appeared dull and weak, and the shadows in the corners seemed darker, more pronounced, almost alive. I couldn't shake the growing sense of unease that crawled up my spine. The guide's stories also began to shift. He started with tales of noble families and wars, but soon moved on to more sinister accounts. He spoke of the prisoners who were chained and forgotten in the castle's dungeons, left to rot in the dark. He told of ghostly apparitions that were said to roam the halls at night, of people who had entered the castle and never left. The way he recounted these tales was unsettling. His voice dropped lower, becoming almost hypnotic, as if he wasn't merely telling a story, but recalling something personal, something he had seen himself. I wasn't alone in feeling the growing dread. The others in the group had gone quiet, their initial excitement replaced with an eerie stillness. I could see it in their faces, the pale, tense expressions of people trying to rationalize their discomfort but failing. We stayed close together, moving almost in unison as we followed the guide deeper into the bowels of the castle. The turning point came when the guide led us down a narrow spiral staircase that seemed to descend forever. The deeper we went, the colder it became. The walls were slick with moisture, the air heavy with the stench of mildew and decay. The stairwell opened up into the dungeons, dark, cramped cells that lined the walls, their iron bars rusted with age. I felt an overwhelming sense of claustrophobia. The place reeked of suffering, and I could almost hear the cries of those who had once been locked away here. The guide's voice, still calm and measured, echoed off the stone walls as he described how prisoners were tortured here, left in the dark, forgotten, until madness overtook them. His words seemed to hang in the air, almost like a curse. And then I saw it. The guide's shadow, unnatural, wrong. It didn't match his movements. As he spoke, gesturing with his hands, his shadow remained still. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it move. Not in sync with him, but on its own, creeping and slithering along the walls like some kind of dark, sentient thing. It twisted and expanded, growing darker and more distinct, its form shifting into something less human and more monstrous. At first, I thought I was imagining it, that maybe the dim light was playing tricks on my mind. But no, there it was, moving with a malevolence all its own. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest, but the others hadn't noticed yet. They were still listening to the guide's chilling stories, unaware of the shadow looming behind him like a predator. That's when the door to the dungeon slammed shut with a deafening crash. We all jumped, panic rising in an instant. One of the travelers, a young man, rushed to the door and pulled at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked, trapping us inside the cold, suffocating darkness of the dungeon. The air felt different now, thick with fear, tinged with the metallic scent of old blood. The guide stood there, his smile widening unnaturally, his eyes glinting with something that made my stomach twist. Behind him, the shadow continued to writhe, growing larger, stretching up the walls like an oil slick spreading across the floor. "You won't be leaving," the guide said, his voice eerily calm, almost cheerful. "Not until they are satisfied." His words sent an icy chill down my spine. They? Who was they? Before I could ask, the whispers began. Faint at first, so soft I could barely hear them. But they grew louder, more insistent, filling the room with a cacophony of disembodied voices. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, murmuring with the voices of the damned. The shadows began to shift and take shape. Faces, twisted and contorted in agony, appeared on the walls, their mouths open in silent screams. Pale hands reached out from the darkness, clawing at the air, desperate to drag us into whatever hell they had come from. We were surrounded. The other travelers screamed, backing into the center of the room, huddling together in terror. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of lead, and my breath came in shallow, panicked gasps. The shadows reached for us, their cold, intangible fingers brushing against my skin, leaving a freezing numbness in their wake. The guide simply stood there, watching us with that same horrifying smile, as though he was enjoying the spectacle. I don't know how long we were trapped in that dungeon, surrounded by those things, those impossible, writhing shadows. Time seemed to lose all meaning. The voices grew louder, the shadows bolder, until it felt like we would be swallowed whole by the darkness. But then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The door creaked open, the whispers faded, and the shadows slithered back into the walls. The guide gave us a small nod, as if this was all part of the tour, and gestured toward the exit. We didn't need to be told twice. We bolted for the door, stumbling over each other in our rush to escape. My heart was still pounding as we ran through the empty halls of the castle, the air thick with the lingering presence of whatever had been down in that dungeon. I didn't look back, not once. I was too terrified of what I might see. When we finally burst out into the daylight, the warmth of the sun felt like a cruel joke. It was as if we had stepped out of one world and into another, a world where the horrors of that castle couldn't reach us. But deep down, I knew the truth. Whatever was in that dungeon wasn't finished with us, and I have no doubt that if I ever return, it will be waiting.
The lodge was nestled deep in the heart of an ancient forest, miles away from civilization. It was one of those rare, isolated spots where the silence was so absolute, it pressed against your ears, amplifying every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves. The dense canopy of trees stretched high into the sky, their thick branches knitting together, allowing only occasional shafts of light to pierce through. The isolation was perfect. At least that's what we thought. It had been my idea to rent the lodge, to disconnect from the chaos of the city and immerse ourselves in nature for a week. The promise of crystal-clear lakes, miles of untouched wilderness, and the rustic charm of the sprawling old lodge had been too tempting to resist. The lodge itself was beautiful, with wide wooden beams and large windows that peered out into the surrounding forest like unblinking eyes. Inside, a stone fireplace dominated the main room, its warmth offering comfort in the cool nights, and the scent of pine wood filled the air, grounding us in the wilderness. At first, everything was perfect. We spent our days hiking through the endless woods, exploring hidden trails that snaked through the underbrush. The evenings were spent swimming in the lake, its waters so clear and still that you could see straight to the bottom, where smooth stones and tangled roots lay undisturbed. At night we would sit around the fire pit, the flames dancing in the crisp air, telling stories and laughing until our voices echoed in the stillness. But by the third day, things started to feel off. It began subtly, so subtle that we almost missed it. The animals, for one. The first morning, we woke to find a deer standing just at the edge of the tree line, its tall, antlered head turned toward the lodge. It didn't move, didn't even twitch. It simply stood there, staring at us with wide, dark eyes. At first, we laughed it off. How often do you wake up to a deer in your yard? But there was something unnerving about the way it stood, frozen, almost as if it wasn't really a deer at all, but a statue. The unsettling part was how long it stayed there. Hours passed, and it didn't budge. Even when we clapped or yelled, it remained rooted to the spot, its gaze unwavering. By the afternoon, it had disappeared, and we shrugged it off as a strange encounter. The following day, though, the animals multiplied. Birds gathered in the trees, perched silently in rows. Squirrels and foxes appeared at the forest's edge, sitting motionless as they stared at the lodge with eerie stillness. It was as if the entire forest had come to a standstill, watching us. My friend Sarah, usually the first to crack a joke, muttered something about feeling like we were being studied. We laughed it off nervously, but there was no denying the strange tension in the air. The animals never came closer, never made a sound, but they didn't need to. Their presence was suffocating, a constant reminder that we weren't alone. On the third night, the footsteps began. It was late, probably close to midnight, and we were gathered around the fireplace in the main room, enjoying the last of the evening's warmth. The windows reflected the flickering flames, creating a strange illusion of fire within the forest. We were mid-conversation when we heard it, the slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps in the leaves outside. At first we paused, thinking it might have been one of us, but the sound came again, clear and unmistakable, moving closer, circling the lodge. We all exchanged glances. There wasn't supposed to be anyone else out here. No neighbors, no campers, no trails nearby. Just us and the wilderness. The sound grew louder, more pronounced, as though whoever or whatever was outside wanted to be heard. Sarah, ever the brave one, grabbed a flashlight and shone it through the large window. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, the undergrowth, but nothing more. No figures, no animals, nothing. Yet the footsteps continued. We pressed our ears to the window, listening as the sound circled us once more, pacing around the perimeter of the lodge like a predator stalking its prey. My skin prickled with unease, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. Every instinct screamed that we weren't alone, but still, we saw nothing. That night, sleep was a distant hope. The sound of footsteps echoed in my mind even when they weren't there, an insidious rhythm that played over and over. At some point, I must have drifted off, only to be jolted awake by what sounded like a low whisper outside my window. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but chilling enough to freeze the blood in my veins. I didn't dare move, barely breathing as I strained to listen. But the only sound that followed was the wind rustling the leaves outside. By morning, we were all exhausted, our nerves frayed, but nothing could have prepared us for what we found. The ground around the lodge was covered in footprints, dozens of them. They circled the lodge in tight, overlapping loops, as if someone or something had been pacing outside all night long. Some of the prints were human, but others were strange, distorted, as if whoever or whatever had made them was dragging something behind them. The worst part? Some of the footprints led straight up to the windows, where they stopped abruptly as though someone had been standing there, watching us sleep. That was when we made the decision to leave. We packed our bags in a hurried silence, every creak of the floorboards or rustle of the wind outside setting us on edge. As we loaded up the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that somewhere deep in the woods, those animals were still there, their eyes following our every move. The forest, once so peaceful, now felt oppressive, like it was closing in around us, eager to reclaim us. We drove away, the lodge disappearing into the distance, swallowed by the trees. No one spoke on the ride back to the city. The silence between us was thick with unspoken fear, each of us replaying the strange events over and over in our minds. None of it made sense, and yet There was no denying the primal terror we had all felt. To this day, I still think about that lodge, about the footsteps in the night and the animals that watched us with too much awareness. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I swear I can still hear those footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling just outside, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. I will never, ever go back to that forest.
I was on vacation in a remote part of Eastern Europe, hoping to escape the usual tourist traps and immerse myself in something more authentic. The region was like a forgotten dream, rolling hills draped in mist, dense forests that seemed to stretch on forever, and quaint little villages that felt untouched by time. It was as if I had stepped into a forgotten century, far removed from the modern world. I had rented a small, secluded cottage on the outskirts of a quiet village, the kind of place where life moved at a slower pace. The locals were friendly, but kept to themselves, speaking in a dialect that I barely understood. And I appreciated the isolation. I thought the solitude was exactly what I needed, until it became something more sinister. One afternoon, I decided to take a long hike through the countryside. The sky was overcast, the air crisp and cool, with an eerie stillness hanging in the atmosphere. Perfect weather for exploring, I told myself, as I set off down a dirt road that meandered through the forest. The deeper I walked, the quieter the world around me became. The trees pressed in from all sides, their branches twisted like ancient skeletal fingers. After a few hours, I came upon something unexpected. A village. At first glance, it seemed no different from any other village I had passed through on my travels. Small, thatched roof cottages, a crumbling stone church with a steeple that reached toward the sky, and narrow cobblestone streets lined with moss and weeds. But something about this village was wrong, deeply wrong. There was no sound, no people, no movement at all. It was as if the entire place had been frozen in time, abandoned, yet somehow not empty. I hesitated at the edge of the village, a wave of unease crawling up my spine. The silence felt oppressive, as though the very air was thick with a presence I couldn't see. Every instinct told me to turn around, to walk away. But curiosity has a way of overriding fear, and I found myself stepping onto the cobblestone street. My footsteps echoed unnaturally loud in the stillness. As I wandered deeper into the village, the decay became more apparent. The windows of the houses were shattered, their wooden doors hanging askew on rusted hinges. Inside, I could see furniture, long abandoned, slowly rotting away. The air smelled faintly of mold and damp earth. Grass and weeds had overtaken the streets, growing tall and wild, as if nature was in the process of reclaiming the village. But there was no sign of life, no animals, no insects, not even the wind stirred the leaves. An uneasy feeling settled in my stomach. Every house I passed seemed worse than the last, as though whatever had driven the people from this place had left a taint behind, something malevolent that clung to the walls like a dark stain. In one house, I spotted a small child's doll lying on the floor, its porcelain face cracked, one glass eye missing. It gave me a sickening sense of dread, as if I had stumbled upon a relic from a family that had fled in a panic and never returned. I pressed on, drawn toward the church that loomed in the center of the village. Its doors, heavy and slightly ajar, creaked as I pushed them open. Inside, the air was colder, mustier, as if the building itself was holding on to something long dead. The faint smell of decay lingered, thick and cloying. The walls were cracked, the ceiling warped with age, and yet the church felt more intact than the rest of the village. I walked down the narrow aisle, my footsteps echoing ominously. Empty wooden pews lined the room, and at the far end stood a stone altar, bare except for a thick layer of dust. Behind the altar was a mural, old and faded, but still discernible. As I approached, the details came into focus, and my blood ran cold. The mural depicted a group of people standing in a circle around something in the center, something dark, shadowy, and indistinct. Their faces were twisted in expressions of sheer terror, their hands raised either in prayer or in a desperate attempt to ward off whatever was at the heart of the circle. The more I looked at it, the more the figures seemed to come alive, their wide eyes staring back at me, pleading for help. The figure in the center of the mural was blurred, almost as if time itself had erased its features, but the darkness around it seemed to pulse with something ancient, something hungry. Suddenly I felt a cold breeze brush the back of my neck. My skin prickled with fear. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest. But the church was empty. The open door let in a sliver of pale, dying light from the overcast sky, but the temperature had plummeted. I could feel it. Something was here with me. Panic surged through me, and I turned back toward the door, desperate to leave. But as I moved, the air grew heavier, pressing down on me like an invisible weight. And then I heard it. A faint whispering, just on the edge of hearing, like voices carried on the wind. The sound was too faint to make out words, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading, desperate, terrified. I bolted from the church, the whispering growing louder in my ears, like a rising tide of voices clawing at my sanity. By the time I reached the street, my chest was heaving with panic, but the nightmare wasn't over. The village had changed. The houses, already decaying, now seemed to sag into the earth, as though they were being consumed by the ground itself. The air was thick with a sickening sense of dread, and the whispering followed me, soft at first, then louder, insistent, like a chorus of the damned. I began to run. As I neared the edge of the village, something caught my eye, a movement in one of the windows of a crumbling house. I stopped, heart pounding, and stared. For a split second, I saw it, a shadowy figure standing motionless in the window, watching me. Its face was obscured, but its eyes burned with an unnatural intensity, glowing faintly in the gloom. I could feel its gaze piercing through me, locking me in place. A wave of cold washed over me, freezing me to the spot. Then the figure was gone. I didn't wait to see if it would return. I sprinted into the forest, the trees closing in around me, their twisted branches like skeletal arms reaching out to pull me back. The whispering followed me, relentless, until finally, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, I reached the edge of the woods. I glanced back once more at the village, now swallowed by the encroaching darkness. The houses seemed to melt into the earth, and where I had seen the figure, there was only blackness. I stumbled back to my cottage, my legs weak and shaking. That night, I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the mural, the faces of those twisted figures staring at me with wide, terrified eyes, and the shadow in the center, waiting to consume them. I left the village the next morning, cutting my trip short. I didn't tell anyone about what I had seen. How could I? Who would believe that a village like that could exist, a place where time had stopped, where the dead whispered and shadows watched? But even now, miles away, the image of that figure still haunts me. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I can still feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. And in the silence, I can still hear the faintest whispers, growing closer.
The cliffside retreat was supposed to be the highlight of my vacation, a secluded sanctuary far removed from the stresses of daily life. Nestled high above the crashing waves, it offered panoramic views of the endless ocean with nothing but the sea and the sky stretching to the horizon. I'd stumbled upon the rental online, an undiscovered gem hidden far from the well-trodden tourist paths. It promised peace, serenity, and, most importantly, total privacy. When I arrived, it seemed every bit as perfect as the photos. The house was breathtaking, a sleek, modern design of glass and steel that blended seamlessly into the cliffside. Floor-to-ceiling windows lined the walls, providing uninterrupted views of the ocean below. The deck jutted out over the cliff's edge, making it feel like I was floating above the water, and the infinity pool mirrored the sea, creating the illusion that it stretched right into the horizon. Miles from the nearest town, there was nothing but the endless rhythm of the waves crashing far below. For the first couple of days, I thought I had found paradise. I spent hours lounging by the pool, reading on the deck, and watching the sun melt into the water each evening. The isolation was comforting at first, the silence a soothing escape from the relentless noise of city life. But by the third night, things began to change. It started as I sat on the deck after dinner, a glass of wine in hand, savouring the quiet. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, and the sky was fading to a deep purple, the stars beginning to prick through the darkening canvas. The waves below, which had been a constant background noise since I arrived, suddenly grew louder, much louder. It wasn't a gradual change, but a sharp increase, like someone had cranked up the volume on a speaker. I stood up, frowning, and walked to the edge of the deck, peering down at the water far below. It looked different, darker, more violent. The waves were no longer lapping gently against the rocks, but crashing with a force that sent spray high into the air. The ocean's once steady rhythm had become chaotic, and I could feel a strange vibration beneath my feet, as though the very cliff I stood on was trembling. A sense of unease settled over me, but I tried to brush it off. Maybe the weather was changing, or it was just some kind of natural tide shift. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck prickled as I walked back inside the house, locking the sliding glass doors behind me. That night I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of the wind howling outside. I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had taken root in my chest. I had just started to drift off when I heard it. A knock. At first I thought it was my imagination. It was faint, barely audible over the wind and the crashing waves. But then it came again, louder this time, a soft, rhythmic tapping against the window. I sat up in bed, heart racing, straining to listen. The sound was unmistakable now, a steady knock, 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 coming from the far side of the room. My stomach twisted in knots. I knew that window. It was on the second floor, high above the ground, with nothing but sheer cliff below it. No one could possibly be outside that window. The knocking continued, louder and more insistent, as though whatever was on the other side was growing impatient. My skin prickled with fear, my mouth dry as I slowly climbed out of bed. Every instinct screamed at me to stay put, to hide, but I couldn't help myself. I crept toward the window, my heart pounding in my chest. The curtains were drawn, but the knocking was relentless now, rapid, almost frantic. My hand trembled as I reached for the curtain. I hesitated, every nerve in my body on edge. Finally, with a deep breath, I yanked it back. Nothing. The window looked out onto the dark night, the faint outline of the ocean barely visible beneath the moonless sky. But there was no one there, no face, no figure, just the empty void beyond the glass. Yet the knocking continued. I staggered back, my pulse racing. It was impossible. No one could be knocking on that window, not at this height. Panic surged through me and I stumbled toward the door, grabbing my phone as I went. My hands were shaking as I dialed the number for the retreat's owner. It was late and I half expected the call to go straight to voicemail, but after a few rings he picked up. His voice was groggy, confused. "Hello?" I tried to steady my voice as I explained what was happening, the knocking, the strange noises, the unnatural waves. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment I thought the call had dropped. Then, in a low, serious tone, he spoke. "You need to leave. Now." The calmness in his voice made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "What do you mean? What's going on?" "Just listen to me. Get out of the house right now." His voice was firm, almost urgent. "Do not wait. Get out before it's too late." I didn't need to be told twice. My adrenaline surged and I grabbed whatever I could, shoving clothes into my bag with frantic hands. The knocking grew even louder now, almost thunderous, echoing through the house as if it were pounding in my very skull. I could feel it in the walls, reverberating with a terrifying force. As I rushed down the stairs, I glanced through the massive windows that overlooked the ocean. My stomach lurched at the sight. The sea was alive with chaos. The once calm waters had transformed into a boiling, churning maelstrom, the waves crashing violently against the cliffs, sending plumes of salt water high into the air. The horizon itself seemed to tilt and shift, as though the ocean was being pulled into some unseen abyss. and in the darkness beyond the waves, I saw shapes, indistinct figures, moving beneath the surface of the water, writhing and twisting in unnatural ways. I bolted for the front door, barely managing to shove it open against the force of the wind that had begun to howl outside. The moment I stepped outside, the knocking stopped, but the feeling of dread only intensified. I could feel something watching me, its presence thick and oppressive, pressing down on me with a weight that made it hard to breathe. I threw my bag into the car and peeled out of the driveway, my tires skidding on the gravel as I sped away from the house. The road was narrow and winding, and I barely kept control as I navigated the sharp turns. The ocean, now hidden by the darkness, still roared behind me as though the very sea itself was coming for me. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back in the nearest town where the lights of civilization felt like a lifeline. I parked in front of a small hotel and sat in the car, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. I tried calling the owner again, but the line was dead, disconnected. I never found out what was happening at that retreat. But I know one thing for sure. Whatever was knocking on that window, whatever was rising from the depths of that ocean, it wasn't human. It wasn't something I ever want to encounter again. And sometimes when I close my eyes at night, I can still hear the faintest knock, knock, knock in the distance.
We had booked a boat tour to a small remote island off the coast. It was advertised as a hidden paradise, far from the crowds, a place where time seemed to stand still. Known for its untouched beauty and secluded beaches, the island seemed like the perfect escape. The idea of a relaxing day, cut off from the world, was exactly what I had hoped for. The boat was small, just enough for the few of us on board. Aside from me, there was a young couple on their honeymoon, and our guide, a local man in his 30s, with sun-weathered skin and a quiet demeanor. He had lived in the area all his life, navigating the waters like second nature. The boat ride was serene. The sky was cloudless, the sun blazing above us, and the sea was calm, a brilliant crystal blue that shimmered in the light. The island came into view slowly, emerging from the horizon like a dream. White sand beaches and towering palm trees framed the shoreline, their shadows dancing across the clear waters. It was paradise. We docked at a small cove, the guide securing the boat while we disembarked. The moment I set foot on the beach, I felt a sense of overwhelming peace, as though the weight of the world had been lifted off my shoulders. The air was warm and salty, the ocean breeze refreshing. The young couple wasted no time setting up for a beach picnic, laughing and posing for photos, while I wandered the shoreline, marveling at how untouched everything seemed. For the first half of the day, everything was perfect. I swam in the warm waters, basked in the sun, and explored the winding paths through the dense foliage. The island was entirely deserted, just as the brochure had promised. No other tourists, no other boats, just us and nature. But by mid-afternoon, something began to change. I first noticed it in the guide. He had been friendly enough when we arrived, sharing local stories and pointing out landmarks on the island. But now, his behavior shifted. His once easygoing demeanor became tense, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line and the horizon beyond the beach. It was subtle at first, a quick glance over his shoulder, a furrowed brow, but it became more pronounced as the day wore on. By late afternoon, the sky had started to change, the sun dipping lower, casting long shadows across the island. The couple was still enjoying themselves, laughing and taking photos, but the guide seemed agitated, pacing near the boat, muttering to himself in a language I didn't understand. I approached him, trying to gauge what was wrong. "Is everything okay?" I asked. He forced a tight smile, though his eyes betrayed him. "Nothing to worry about," he said quickly, but his voice was tense, the forced calm doing little to hide his unease. I looked around, noticing how the atmosphere of the island had shifted. What had been idyllic and serene just hours ago now felt oppressive, the air thicker, heavier. Even the sounds of the ocean seemed different, the waves crashing harder against the shore, a deep, rumbling undertone vibrating beneath the earth. The shadows cast by the palm trees seemed unnaturally long, stretching out across the sand like dark fingers, reaching for us. A cold knot of anxiety began to form in my stomach. As the sun dipped closer to the horizon, the guide's urgency grew. He kept glancing at his watch, muttering under his breath, and pacing near the boat as though he couldn't wait to leave. Finally, as the sky began to turn a deep orange, he approached the couple and me, his face pale and his jaw clenched. "We need to go. Now," he said, his voice strained with urgency. The couple hesitated, clearly reluctant to cut their day short. "Just a few more photos," the woman said, holding up her phone. "It's almost sunset." "No." The guide's voice was sharper now, almost frantic. "We can't stay here after dark. It's not safe." The way he said it, his tone, the look in his eyes, sent a chill down my spine. The couple finally relented, sensing the tension, and we began packing up. I hurriedly gathered my things, my heart starting to race as I glanced back at the tree line. For the briefest moment, I thought I saw movement, something tall and thin, darting between the trees. My pulse quickened, but when I looked again, there was nothing there. We made our way back to the boat as the sky darkened rapidly, the sun sinking below the horizon faster than seemed natural. The once vibrant island was now cloaked in deep shadows, and a cold wind had begun to blow in from the sea. The waves, once gentle, now crashed violently against the shore, as though the ocean itself had turned hostile. As we boarded the boat, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. There, just beyond the tree line, I saw it again. Something moving. A figure, tall and gaunt, barely visible in the fading light. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, watching as the figure stepped out from the shadows and onto the beach. It was impossible to make out its features, but its silhouette was unnatural. Too tall, too thin, with arms that hung down unnaturally long by its sides. It stood perfectly still, watching us. I could feel its gaze, cold and unblinking, as we pushed off from the shore. I wasn't the only one who saw it. The guide's eyes were locked on the figure, his face pale with fear. He gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles white, and without a word, he gunned the engine, steering the boat away from the island as fast as it could go. The island grew smaller in the distance, swallowed by the encroaching darkness. But even as we sped away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. I looked back one last time, and there, standing at the water's edge, was the figure. It hadn't moved. It simply stood there, watching us leave, its form barely visible against the darkening sky. My heart pounded in my chest, and I turned back to the guide, my voice trembling. What was that?" The guide didn't answer at first. He just stared straight ahead, his face ashen. After a long moment, he muttered something under his breath in a language I didn't understand. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and filled with fear. "That island," he said, his eyes never leaving the horizon, "is cursed. It's not a place for us. We were never meant to be there." The boat sped faster, cutting through the rough water. I sat in silence, too terrified to ask any more questions, the couple now quiet as well, having sensed the shift in the air. As we neared the mainland, the guide's tension never lessened. Even as the island faded into the distance, it felt like it still had a hold on us, like we had barely escaped whatever waited there after dark. When we finally docked, the guide tied the boat hastily, urging us off without a word of goodbye. I watched him disappear into the night, his steps hurried, as if he couldn't put enough distance between himself and the sea. I haven't been back to that island since, but I dream of it. Nightmares where I'm back on the beach, the sun sinking low, and the figure standing at the edge of the water, waiting, always waiting. And in those dreams, I know, this time I won't escape.
We had booked a boat tour to a small, remote island off the coast. It was advertised as a hidden paradise, far from the crowds, a place where time seemed to stand still. Known for its untouched beauty and secluded beaches, the island seemed like the perfect escape. The idea of a relaxing day, cut off from the world, was exactly what I had hoped for. The boat was small, just enough for the few of us on board. Aside from me, there was a young couple on their honeymoon, and our guide, a local man in his 30s, with sun-weathered skin and a quiet demeanor. He had lived in the area all his life, navigating the waters like second nature. The boat ride was serene. The sky was cloudless, the sun blazing above us, and the sea was calm, a brilliant crystal blue that shimmered in the light. The island came into view slowly, emerging from the horizon like a dream. White sand beaches and towering palm trees framed the shoreline, their shadows dancing across the clear waters. It was paradise. We docked at a small cove, the guide securing the boat while we disembarked. The moment I set foot on the beach, I felt a sense of overwhelming peace, as though the weight of the world had been lifted off my shoulders. The air was warm and salty, the ocean breeze refreshing. The young couple wasted no time setting up for a beach picnic, laughing and posing for photos, while I wandered the shoreline, marveling at how untouched everything seemed. For the first half of the day, everything was perfect. I swam in the warm waters, basked in the sun, and explored the winding paths through the dense foliage. The island was entirely deserted, just as the brochure had promised. No other tourists, no other boats, just us and nature. But by mid-afternoon, something began to change. I first noticed it in the guide. He had been friendly enough when we arrived, sharing local stories and pointing out landmarks on the island. But now his behavior shifted. His once easygoing demeanor became tense, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line and the horizon beyond the beach. It was subtle at first, a quick glance over his shoulder, a furrowed brow, but it became more pronounced as the day wore on. By late afternoon, the sky had started to change, the sun dipping lower, casting long shadows across the island. The couple was still enjoying themselves, laughing and taking photos, but the guide seemed agitated, pacing near the boat, muttering to himself in a language I didn't understand. I approached him, trying to gauge what was wrong. "Is everything okay?" I asked. He forced a tight smile, though his eyes betrayed him. "Nothing to worry about," he said quickly, but his voice was tense, the forced calm doing little to hide his unease. I looked around, noticing how the atmosphere of the island had shifted. What had been idyllic and serene just hours ago now felt oppressive, the air thicker, heavier. Even the sounds of the ocean seemed different, the waves crashing harder against the shore, a deep, rumbling undertone vibrating beneath the earth. The shadows cast by the palm trees seemed unnaturally long, stretching out across the sand like dark fingers, reaching for us. A cold knot of anxiety began to form in my stomach. As the sun dipped closer to the horizon, the guide's urgency grew. He kept glancing at his watch, muttering under his breath and pacing near the boat as though he couldn't wait to leave. Finally, as the sky began to turn a deep orange, he approached the couple and me, his face pale and his jaw clenched. "We need to go. Now," he said, his voice strained with urgency. The couple hesitated, clearly reluctant to cut their day short. "Just a few more photos," the woman said, holding up her phone. "It's almost sunset." "No." The guide's voice was sharper now, almost frantic. "We can't stay here after dark. It's not safe." The way he said it, his tone, the look in his eyes, sent a chill down my spine. The couple finally relented, sensing the tension, and we began packing up. I hurriedly gathered my things, my heart starting to race as I glanced back at the tree line. For the briefest moment, I thought I saw movement, something tall and thin, darting between the trees. My pulse quickened, but when I looked again, there was nothing there. We made our way back to the boat as the sky darkened rapidly, the sun sinking below the horizon faster than seemed natural. The once vibrant island was now cloaked in deep shadows, and a cold wind had begun to blow in from the sea. The waves, once gentle, now crashed violently against the shore, as though the ocean itself had turned hostile. As we boarded the boat, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. There, just beyond the tree line, I saw it again. Something moving, A figure, tall and gaunt, barely visible in the fading light. My breath caught in my throat and I froze, watching as the figure stepped out from the shadows and onto the beach. It was impossible to make out its features, but its silhouette was unnatural. Too tall, too thin, with arms that hung down unnaturally long by its sides. It stood perfectly still, watching us. I could feel its gaze, cold and unblinking, as we pushed off from the shore. I wasn't the only one who saw it. The guide's eyes were locked on the figure, his face pale with fear. He gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles white, and without a word he gunned the engine, steering the boat away from the island as fast as it could go. The island grew smaller in the distance, swallowed by the encroaching darkness. But even as we sped away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. I looked back one last time, and there, standing at the water's edge, was the figure. It hadn't moved. It simply stood there, watching us leave, its form barely visible against the darkening sky. My heart pounded in my chest, and I turned back to the guide, my voice trembling. What was that? The guide didn't answer at first. He just stared straight ahead, his face ashen. After a long moment, he muttered something under his breath in a language I didn't understand. Finally he spoke, his voice low and filled with fear. "That island," he said, his eyes never leaving the horizon, "is cursed. It's not a place for us. We were never meant to be there." The boat sped faster, cutting through the rough water. I sat in silence, too terrified to ask any more questions, the couple now quiet as well, having sensed the shift in the air. As we neared the mainland, the guide's tension never lessened. Even as the island faded into the distance, it felt like it still had a hold on us, like we had barely escaped whatever waited there after dark. When we finally docked, the guide tied the boat hastily, urging us off without a word of goodbye. I watched him disappear into the night. His steps hurried, as if he couldn't put enough distance between himself and the sea. I haven't been back to that island since, but I dream of it. Nightmares where I'm back on the beach, the sun sinking low, and the figure standing at the edge of the water, waiting, always waiting. And in those dreams, I know, this time, I won't escape.
The locals had warned us not to swim in the lagoon. They didn't tell us why, just that it wasn't safe, and that we should steer clear of its waters. But we were stubborn. We were on vacation, a group of thrill seekers used to ignoring superstitions and local folklore in search of adventure. The crystalline water was too inviting, the secluded cove too picturesque to resist. It was hidden away, surrounded by thick jungle, a place that felt like it had been waiting for us to discover it. The sky was clear, the sun high above us, and the lagoon seemed like paradise. There were 6 of us, close friends who had traveled together for years, always seeking out the most beautiful remote spots. Our group had found the lagoon by chance during a long hike through the jungle. After hours of trekking in the heat, the shimmering blue water had beckoned us like a mirage. It was perfect, calm, serene, untouched. We felt like we had stumbled upon something magical, and in our excitement, we ignored the locals' warnings. As soon as we dove into the lagoon, it was like the rest of the world fell away. The water was cool and refreshing, its clarity almost unreal. We swam for hours, laughing, splashing, and lounging on the smooth rocks that lined the shore. It was the kind of place you could lose track of time, where the worries of everyday life felt like distant memories. For a while, it truly felt like paradise. But then, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, something shifted. The air grew heavier, almost suffocating, and the jungle around us seemed to close in. The water, once sparkling and clear, now appeared darker, murky. The stillness of the lagoon became unnerving, as if the water was holding its breath, waiting for something. "We should head back," someone suggested, but there was an edge to their voice, a nervousness we hadn't felt before. We climbed out of the water, grabbing our towels and preparing to hike back to the campsite. That's when Sarah screamed. I turned just in time to see her stumble backward, her hand clamped around her leg. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. She pointed to a long, deep scratch that ran from her ankle to her knee, the skin torn as though something had raked its claws through her flesh. Blood trickled down her leg, staining the sand beneath her feet. "What the hell?" I whispered, kneeling beside her. We examined her leg, but there was no explanation for the wound. The water had been calm and we hadn't seen any sharp rocks or debris. There was nothing in the lagoon that could have caused an injury like that. Nothing visible, at least. "It's fine," Sarah said, though her voice trembled. "It's just a scratch." But the look in her eyes told me she didn't believe her own words. We tried to shake it off as we gathered our things and made our way back to camp, but the atmosphere had changed. The jungle, once vibrant with the sounds of birds and insects, had fallen eerily silent. The air felt thick, heavy with a sense of dread that none of us could shake. Every step we took seemed to echo, and the trees cast long shadows that seemed to stretch out toward us as if the jungle itself was alive, watching us. That night, as we sat around the campfire, Sarah's condition worsened. The scratch on her leg, which had seemed minor at first, had started to swell. The skin around it turned an angry red, and she complained of a burning sensation that spread up her leg. She shivered even though the night was warm and sticky with humidity. We wrapped her in blankets, but nothing seemed to help. Her teeth chattered and her skin grew paler by the minute. "Maybe we should head back to the village," I suggested. But the village was miles away, and the jungle was dangerous to navigate at night. Still, something about Sarah's condition felt wrong, unnatural. She was sweating, mumbling incoherently. Her eyes glazed over with fear. Her hand trembled as she clutched at her leg, but the wound looked worse now. Dark veins seemed to be spreading from the scratch, creeping up her skin like some kind of infection. By midnight, Sarah was no longer herself. Her eyes had taken on a wild, haunted look, darting around the campsite as though she could see something none of us could. She thrashed in her sleeping bag, muttering in a language that didn't sound like her own voice, her body rigid and tense. We tried to hold her down, to comfort her, but nothing worked. It was as if something had taken hold of her, something we couldn't see or understand. Her breathing grew shallow, her skin cold to the touch, and just before dawn she went still. For a moment we thought it was over, that she had passed out from exhaustion. But when we tried to wake her, she didn't respond. Her skin was deathly pale, her eyes half open but unseeing, and her pulse was weak, barely there. Panic set in, and we decided to carry her back to the village, hoping someone there could help. As we approached the edge of the lagoon, Sarah let out a terrible, inhuman scream. Her eyes flew open, wide and wild, and she began convulsing violently, her body twisting in ways that seemed impossible. We tried to hold on to her, but she broke free with a strength that shouldn't have been possible, her face contorted with terror. Without warning, she bolted toward the lagoon, running with an unnatural speed, her body moving like a puppet on strings. "Sarah, no!" we shouted, chasing after her, but it was too late. She plunged into the water, disappearing beneath the surface without a sound. As if the lagoon had swallowed her whole, we searched for hours, calling her name, diving into the water, desperately trying to find her. But the lagoon was dark now, its depths impenetrable, and there was no trace of Sarah. She was gone as if she had never been there at all. The next morning, we stumbled back to the village, dazed and terrified. When we told the locals what had happened, their faces turned grim. They told us that the lagoon was cursed, that its waters were hungry for souls. They said it had been that way for generations, that those who entered the lagoon often did not return. The scratches, they explained, were a warning, a mark that meant the lagoon had chosen its victim. We were lucky, they said, lucky to have escaped with our lives. To this day, I can still hear Sarah's scream echoing in my nightmares. The memory of her pale, haunted face as she ran into the water haunts me. I don't know what took her or where she went, but I know one thing for certain. Whatever is in that lagoon is still waiting, still hungry, and I'll never go near those waters again.